You just got paid. You see that direct deposit hit, $200 after taxes, and immediately you do what every financial expert told you to do. You transfer $500 to your emergency fund. You're being responsible. You're being smart. You're following the rules. Your emergency fund now has $11,400 in it, sitting in a high-yield savings account earning 4.5% interest. You feel secure, protected, like you've built a financial cushion that means you're finally doing things right. Dave Ramsey would be proud. Suze Orman would approve. Every financial literacy course you've ever taken said this is step one. But here's what none of them told you. That $11,400 emergency fund is one of the most expensive financial decisions you're making. And over the next 30 years, it's going to cost you over $500,000 in lost wealth. Not because emergency funds are bad, but because the way you're being told to build them is mathematically catastrophic. I know that sounds insane. I know you're thinking I'm about to tell you to invest your emergency fund in crypto or put it all in Tesla calls. I'm not. I'm going to show you exactly why the traditional emergency fund advice, save 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash, is designed to keep you feeling safe while keeping you poor. And I'm going to show you what actually wealthy people do instead. Let me start with the math that nobody wants you to calculate. You have $10,000 in an emergency fund earning 4% interest. That's $400 per year. Sounds decent, right? But inflation is running at 3.5%, so your real return is 0.5%. You're barely keeping up with inflation. In purchasing power terms, you're treading water. Now let's compare that to the stock market. Historical average return, 10% per year. If that same $10,000 was invested in an S&P 500 index fund, it would earn $1,000 per year on average. That's $600 more per year than sitting in savings. Over 30 years, that $10,000 in savings grows to $32,434. That same $10,000 invested grows to $174,494. You just gave up $142,060 for the feeling of security. But it gets worse because you're not keeping $10,000 in savings. You're keeping $10,000 and adding to it every month. Most financial advisors tell you to save 3 to 6 months of expenses. If your expenses are $4,000 per month, that's $12,000 to $24,000 sitting in cash, earning basically nothing in real terms. Let's say you maintain a $15,000 emergency fund for 30 years. At 4% interest, it grows to $48,651. If that $15,000 had been invested at 10% instead, it would be worth $261,741. You lost $213,090 for one emergency fund. Now let's get really dark. What if you're adding to that emergency fund every year? Let's say you put $2,000 per year into your emergency fund for the first 5 years until you hit $20,000. Then you just leave it there. Those contributions are also suffering opportunity cost. Every dollar that goes into the emergency fund instead of investments is a dollar that can't compound. Let me introduce you to Marcus. He's 28. He makes $75,000 per year. He has $3,200 in monthly expenses. Financial advisors told him to save 6 months of expenses as an emergency fund. That's $19,200. Marcus is responsible. He saves aggressively. By age 30, he has his $19,200 emergency fund fully funded in a savings account earning 4%. He feels amazing. He's financially secure. Marcus keeps that emergency fund for the next 30 years. He never touches it. He's lucky. No major emergencies. At age 60, his emergency fund is worth $62,465 thanks to compound interest. Not bad, right? Except if Marcus had invested that same $19,200 at age 30 in an index fund and left it alone for 30 years, it would be worth $334,847. He paid $272,382 for the feeling of security. That's $250,000 in retirement wealth he sacrificed to keep cash in a savings account, just in case. Now let's compare Marcus to his friend Diane. Diane is also 28, also makes $75,000, also has $3,200 in monthly expenses. But Diane read somewhere that emergency funds in cash are a trap. So instead of saving $19,200 in cash, she saves $3,200, 1 month of expenses, in cash. The rest she invests. She puts $16,000 into an index fund at age 30. Over the next 30 years, Diane has 3 actual emergencies. Once at age 35, she loses her job and needs to live on her emergency fund for 3 weeks until she finds a new one. She pulls $2,000 from her index fund, pays a small capital gains tax, and covers her gap. Another time at age 44, her car dies and she needs $4,500 for a replacement. She pulls it from her index fund. Third time at age 52, she has a medical emergency not fully covered by insurance. She needs $7,000. She pulls it from investments. In total, Diane pulled $1,350 from her investments for emergencies over 30 years. She paid some capital gains taxes on those withdrawals, maybe $2,000 total, but her initial $16,000 investment still compounded for 30 years, even with those withdrawals. At age 60, her investment account is worth approximately $260,000, accounting for the withdrawals. Marcus, who kept everything in cash safely, has $62,465. Diane has $260,000. That's $197,535 more wealth because she was willing to invest her emergency fund and accept the minor inconvenience of selling investments when emergencies happened. But here's where the traditional advice defenders start freaking out. What if there's a market crash? What if Diane needed money in 2008 when the market was down 50%? She'd have to sell at a loss. Fair concern. Let's examine it. In 2008, the S&P 500 dropped from a peak of 1,565 to a bottom of 676. That's a 56.8% decline. Brutal. But here's what actually happened to people with money invested. If you invested in 2007 at the peak and held through 2008, you lost half your value on paper. But if you held through the recovery, by 2013 you were back to even. By 2024, that investment would have tripled. The people who got destroyed in 2008 weren't the ones who had to sell investments for emergencies. They were the ones who panic sold at the bottom and never bought back in. And here's the part nobody talks about. Even if you had to sell investments at the bottom in 2008 to cover an emergency, you'd still likely be better off than keeping that money in cash for a decade. Let's say you invested $10,000 in 2007 at the peak. By March 2009, it was worth $4,300. Awful. But if you had kept it in cash from 2007 to 2009, earning 2% interest, you'd have $10,104. So yes, if you had an emergency in March 2009 and had to sell your investments, you'd have access to $4,300 instead of $10,404. You'd be worse off by $6,104 in that moment. But here's the reality check. Most emergencies don't require your entire emergency fund. They require a portion. If you needed $5,000 in March 2009, you could have sold $5,000 worth of your holdings, which would require selling about $11,628 worth of shares that had declined 56.8% and still kept the rest invested to recover. Or you could have used credit cards for the emergency, paid them off over 6 months while the market recovered, and never sold your investments at all. And this assumes the absolute worst case scenario, that you invested at the literal peak of the market and had an emergency at the literal bottom. The odds of this happening are infinitesimally small. Most of the time, you're going to be somewhere in between. Your investments will be up or down slightly or recovering. You're not going to have an emergency at the exact worst possible moment every single time. But let's say you're still worried. Let's say you absolutely cannot stomach the idea of potentially having to sell investments during a downturn. Fine. Here's what actually wealthy people do instead. They keep 1-2 months of expenses in cash, not 6 months, not 12 months, just enough to cover immediate gaps. Everything else gets invested. And then they have a home equity line of credit, HELOC, or a margin line against their investment account as backup. This gives them access to capital in true emergencies without keeping huge amounts of cash sitting idle. If something catastrophic happens, they can borrow against their assets at low interest rates, cover the emergency, and pay it back over time without ever having to sell investments at unfavorable prices. They keep their wealth working at 10% while having access to emergency capital at 5% interest cost. The math works in their favor. Now let me address the psychological argument. But having cash makes me feel secure. I sleep better knowing it's there. I get it. I really do. But you know what also makes you feel secure? Having $500,000 more in retirement. Not being broke at 65 because you prioritize the feeling of safety over actual wealth accumulation. Financial security isn't about having cash in the bank today. It's about having assets that compound over decades. The feeling of security from a large emergency fund is an expensive illusion. What actually creates security is having income-producing assets, marketable skills, and a growing net worth. The person with $100,000 in investments and $2,000 in cash is more financially secure than the person with $30,000 in cash and $0 in investments, because the first person has capital that's growing. The second person has a melting ice cube. Here's the really insidious part of the emergency fund myth. It's almost always the first step in every financial plan. Step 1, save your emergency fund. Step 2, pay off debt. Step 3, invest for retirement. This ordering is catastrophic for wealth building. It tells people to spend their early years, the years with the most compounding runway, saving cash, the exact opposite of what builds wealth. A 25-year-old who spends 3 years saving a $20,000 emergency fund before investing anything has lost the 3 most valuable investment years of their life. If they had invested that $20,000 at age 25 instead of age 28, it would be worth 20% more at retirement just from those extra 3 years of compounding. The traditional advice literally costs young people hundreds of thousands in lifetime wealth. The emergency fund myth exists because it's easy to sell. It's simple. It's low risk. It makes people feel like they're making progress. Financial advisors love it because it's the path of least resistance. Nobody gets sued for telling someone to keep cash in a savings account, but they should get sued for the opportunity cost they're creating. Let me tell you what I did. At age 27, I had $8,000 saved. Traditional advice said to keep building that to $15,000, $20,000 before investing. I said, screw that. I kept $2,000 in checking as a buffer. I invested the other $6,000 in index funds. I opened a 0% APR credit card for emergencies. Over the next 15 years, I had 4 actual emergencies where I needed money fast. Twice I used the credit card and paid it off within 3 months. Once I sold some index funds. Once I used a margin loan against my portfolio. Total cost of handling those emergencies, maybe $500 in interest and fees. Meanwhile, that $6,000 invested at age 27 is now worth over $45,000 at age 42. If I had kept it in savings as an emergency fund, it would be worth maybe $9,000. I made $36,000 by being willing to handle emergencies slightly less conveniently. That's a 7,200% return on inconvenience. Here's what you should actually do. Keep 1 month of expenses in cash. That's it. If your expenses are $4,000 per month, keep $4,000 liquid. Everything else gets invested immediately. Open a credit card with a $10,000+ limit for emergencies. Use it if you need to, pay it off quickly, or get a HELOC if you own property, or open a margin account against your investments. These give you emergency access to capital without sacrificing decades of compound returns. The goal is not to have cash sitting idle. The goal is to have access to capital when needed. There's a huge difference. The person with $10,000 in cash has $10,000 of access. The person with $50,000 in investments has $50,000 of access, plus it's growing. They're more financially secure, not less. Now, I know some of you are thinking about job loss. What if I lose my job and can't get another one for 6 months? I need 6 months of cash. Do you, though? Have you ever actually been unemployed for 6 months? Most people who lose their jobs find new ones within 2 to 3 months. If you have in-demand skills, probably faster. And if you have investments, you can sell them to cover the gap, or use unemployment benefits, or do freelance work, or any number of things that don't require having $25,000 sitting in cash for a scenario that probably won't happen. This is the insurance mentality applied to emergency funds. Better safe than sorry. But insurance costs money. Keeping $20,000 in cash instead of invested is paying a $1,200 per year premium, the difference between 10% invested returns and 4% savings returns. Every year. Forever. Is that premium worth it for a risk that might never materialize? For most people, absolutely not. Let's do one more comparison. Person A follows traditional advice, saves $20,000 emergency fund in cash, then invests $500 a month for 30 years. Person B keeps $5,000 in cash, invests the other $15,000 immediately, then invests $500 a month for 30 years. Both people invest the same amount monthly. The only difference is person B invested their emergency fund. After 30 years at 10% returns, person A has $20,000 in cash plus $130,244 in investments, or now $150,244 total. Person B has $5,000 in cash plus the $391,986 in investments, but now in $396,986 total. Person B has $246,842 more wealth from making one decision differently at the start. That's the cost of the emergency fund myth, $250,000 over a lifetime per person. Multiply that across 100 million Americans following this advice, and you're talking about $25 trillion in lost wealth. That's not hyperbole. That's the actual cost of bad financial advice at scale. The emergency fund myth is a trap. It keeps you feeling safe while keeping you poor. It prioritizes the illusion of security over actual wealth building. It costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars in lifetime wealth for the convenience of not having to sell investments or use credit in rare emergency situations. It's financially destructive advice dressed up as wisdom. Here's your homework. Calculate your current emergency fund. Multiply it by 17.4. That's what money grows to over 30 years at 10% annual returns. That's what your emergency fund is costing you in retirement wealth. Look at that number, feel it. Then decide if keeping that much cash is actually worth the opportunity cost. For most of you, the answer is going to be no, which means it's time to change the strategy. Keep 1 to 2 months in cash. Invest everything else. Set up backup access to capital through credit cards, HELOCs, or margin. Accept that emergencies might occasionally require you to sell investments or pay some interest. That minor inconvenience is worth hundreds of thousands in additional lifetime wealth. The people keeping giant emergency funds are following advice designed for people in the 1980s with pension plans and stable careers. That world doesn't exist anymore. You need to build wealth, not safety nets. You need assets that compound, not cash that erodes. You need to stop following advice that was never designed to make you rich. Comment below how much you have in your emergency fund right now. No judgment, just data. I guarantee most of you have way more than you need, and now you know exactly what it's costing you. The question is whether you're going to do something about it. If this destroyed your faith in traditional financial advice, good. Subscribe for more. We're going to keep exposing the myths that keep people poor while making them feel responsible. New videos every week showing you what actually builds wealth versus what just makes you feel safe. The emergency fund myth is designed to keep you broke. Now you know better. Now you can do better. Stop hoarding cash. Start building wealth. Thank me in 30 years when you're a millionaire because you refused to follow advice that was designed to keep you poor. Thanks for watching. Liquidate that emergency fund. The only real emergency is dying broke because you were too scared to invest.